host, Guido Perino. Thank you for joining me. I hope that if you're not a subscriber, you take an opportunity to do that now. Today, I want to get into CUSMA without the US, pain, power, and why Canada must stay steadfast. A topic to explore what's been going on in the news in recent weeks. Let me start with a question that feels uncomfortable to perhaps even ask out loud. What would CUSMA look like if the United States wasn't at the center of it? Not rhetorically, not politically, structurally. Because when we talk about CUSMA, we talk about it like a partnership, like three countries standing shoulder to shoulder. But the truth is, it's never really been that. It's been a system with gravity. And that gravity has always pulled towards one place. The question isn't whether Canada and Mexico rely on the US. The real question is, what happens when reliance stops being stability and starts becoming risk? That question wasn't hypothetical at Davos this year, the World Economic Forum. And what stood out wasn't panic. It was realism. At the World Economic Forum, Mark Carney put language to something a lot of countries are feeling, but rarely say out loud. He said, and this matters, we are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Not a slow adjustment, not a recalibration, a rupture. And he went further. He talked about how the rules-based international order, the one Canada built its prosperity around, has faded. That great powers now act unconstrained. That economic integration itself is being used as leverage. And then came the line that really framed this entire conversation. Middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. That wasn't applause line rhetoric. That was a warning. At Davos, there was a recurring idea that kept surfacing beneath the speeches and panels. Great powers can afford to act alone. Middle powers can't. But middle powers can act together if they stop outsourcing their security and prosperity to someone else's stability. That's a subtle idea, and it's a radical one. Because for years, Canada's economic strategy has quietly assumed one thing: whatever happens, the US market will be there. Mexico's strategy has assumed the same. But what if being there comes with volatility? Tariffs one year, threats the next, deals that get reopened every election cycle. At some point, predictability disappears. And predictability is what trade actually runs on. Markets don't require friendship. They require consistency. When consistency becomes conditional, dependency stops being neutral and starts becoming exposure. CUSMA works because the US market is enormous, close, wealthy, and consumption heavy. That's not ideology, that's math. Roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports go south. Mexico sends even more. Factories aren't built for patriotism. They're built for access. So let's be honest. If the US stepped away from North American trade frameworks tomorrow, Canada and Mexico would feel it immediately. This wouldn't be abstract. Supply chains would snap. Investment would pause. Jobs would be disrupted. And yes, people would feel pain. That's the part nobody should minimize. This is where a lot of listeners instinctively push back, because it's one thing to talk about resilience in theory. It's another to live through higher prices, job uncertainty, and political noise. People don't experience economies in decades, they experience them in paychecks. Carney didn't deny this at Davos. He acknowledged it, but he reframed it. He warned against what he called living within the lie, maintaining arrangements we know are fragile simply because they feel familiar. Because when integration becomes the source of vulnerability, pretending otherwise doesn't protect people. It delays the reckoning and makes it worse when it comes. That's why short-term pain is so hard to sell politically. But it's also why avoiding it entirely is often the most expensive choice. Let's talk about Canada first. If the US stepped away from North American trade frameworks, Canada would not glide into a soft landing. There would be real pain, short-term pain, job disruptions, price shocks, political backlash, but Canada would not collapse. What would happen instead is something Carney hinted at in Davos: a forced reckoning, a moment where convenience stops masquerading as strategy. Canada would have to accelerate things it's already half doing: diversifying trade, processing more of its own resources, building value-added industries instead of shipping raw inputs. And yes, that costs more at first. This is the part people resist, because dependency always looks cheap until it isn't. Now, layer in the political reality. Trump's rhetoric toward Canada is intentionally destabilizing. It's designed to reassert hierarchy, not partnership. And at Davos, he made that clear, openly challenging Carney's message and implying Canadian prosperity exists at America's discretion. Carney's response was calm and telling. Canada, he said, doesn't survive because of anyone's goodwill. It survives because of its people, its institutions, and its capacity to adapt. This is why steadfastness matters. Not bravado, not retaliation, steadiness. Because reacting emotionally to rhetoric is exactly how leverage is lost. Mexico's situation is even more intense. Its integration with the US economy is deeper, faster, and more fragile in the short term. A US withdrawal would hit manufacturing hard, employment would be affected, currency pressure would follow. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Mexico's biggest long-term risk isn't losing access to the US. It's being locked into a role where it never fully escapes being the low-cost extension of someone else's economy. That was another undercurrent at Davos. Countries stuck in perpetual dependency don't gain security. They inherit instability they can't control. Mexico has leverage, geography, demographics, industrial depth. And if it's forced to diversify, it doesn't disappear, it recalibrates. Painful? Yes, but strategically clarifying. This is where the conversation shifts, because the question isn't whether Canada or Mexico could replace the US. They can't. The real question is whether they could reduce vulnerability by acting more deliberately together and outward, instead of upward. Carney spoke repeatedly in Davos about coalitions of middle powers, not permanent alliances, not ideology clubs, flexible partnerships built around shared interests, shared standards, shared resilience. The idea fits Canada and Mexico far better than blind reliance on a single dominant partner. More direct trade between them, more joint positioning toward Europe and Indo-Pacific, more shared standards, less reactive policy. Not isolation, resilience. This is why renewing CUSMA matters and why it must be done without fear. Renewal doesn't mean submission. It does not mean pretending volatility doesn't exist. It means negotiating from clarity, staying in the agreement while strengthening alternatives, honoring commitments while removing illusions. Carney was explicit about this. Canada respects its agreements, but it will not confuse dependence with partnership. That distinction is everything. So, would Canada and Mexico benefit without the US? Not tomorrow, not cheaply, not without disruption. But in a world where the old order is gone, and that's the world Carney described at Davos, resilience beats comfort, diversification beats dependency, and honesty beats illusion. Canada doesn't need to reject the US to thrive, but it does need to stop acting as if safety comes from someone else's clarity. That's not radical, that's realism. And the more Canadians understand that, the more prepared they'll be for whatever comes next. Thank you for joining me here on The Ordinary Effect. Please, if you're not a subscriber, subscribe. I hope you come back next week. Take care, be good, stay safe.